The story you're about to hear isn't fantasy. It's not folklore. It's carved from real names, real blood, and real decisions that shaped cities and lives for generations. This is the true story of the Mafia in America. Blood, business, and silence. If you enjoy listening to carefully told history to wind down your day, tap subscribe. These stories are made to be heard, not hurried. And one more thing, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We love seeing how far these stories reach across the world. Now, close your eyes and imagine. Imagine a quiet street in New York, 1931. The bakery's closed. The butcher doesn't talk. The neighborhood knows, but says nothing. A street lamps buzz faintly. A sedan idles just a little too long at the corner. Mothers usher their children indoors with a whisper. There is a rhythm here, unspoken, strict. Orders go out with a nod. Debts are collected with silence, and the men who run the block, they don't need permission. They already have it. To outsiders, the Mafia was crime, pure and simple. But inside the code, it was something more. It was culture, especially for first and second generation immigrants who brought with them memories of Sicily's old world honor and the iron grip of omerta. It was survival in neighborhoods where the American dream came late or not at all. It was fear, certainly, but also loyalty, order, and a strange kind of stability. The Mafia in America wasn't just a criminal network. It became a shadow system that grew alongside the nation itself. And it started long before that quiet street. In the next part, we'll trace its roots, back to the docks, sweatshops, and slums of the late 1800s. It would be easy, too easy, to dismiss the Mafia as just criminals in sharp suits with dark eyes and quicker guns. But the truth runs deeper than headlines and Hollywood scripts. The Mafia in America wasn't born from greed alone. It was forged from need. For many Italian immigrants, arriving in a new land meant poverty, discrimination, and powerless isolation in overcrowded tenements. Law enforcement didn't protect them. Employers exploited them. So they turned inward, toward each other, toward the old codes. In the neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, New Orleans, and beyond, family meant more than blood. It meant protection. Omerta, the code of silence, wasn't cowardice. It was survival. Loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a rule. Fear wasn't failure. It was respect. The Mafia offered what America didn't order, justice on its own terms, and a ladder, however brutal, to power. Children grew up understanding that some debts weren't written down, that some favors could save your life, or end it, that a nod from the wrong man could mean you didn't come home that night. In this world, power didn't shout. It whispered, and everyone knew to listen. This is the story of how a Sicilian tradition of survival became an American empire of crime. To understand the Mafia in America, we first have to leave it entirely. We go back, far back, to dusty hillsides and orange groves, to the island of Sicily in the 19th century, where the roots of this shadow empire first took hold. At the time, Sicily was a land of peasants and landlords, a place where vast estates were owned by the rich and ruled with indifference. Justice belonged to the nobility, and power came from land, not law. For most people, protection didn't come from courts or councils. It came from trust, from family, and when needed, from force. Rural feudalism shaped everything. Farmers worked soil they didn't own. Bandits roamed the hills, and the government, when it bothered to show up, was seen not as a savior, but another predator. Courts were corrupt, taxes were brutal. So the people did what they had to. They turned inward. They kept quiet. They made alliances not with institutions, but with men they could count on. Out of this distrust grew secret societies, networks of loyalty and mutual protection. These weren't yet the Mafia as we think of it today, but they were close. Men who controlled territory, who kept order with fear, who settled disputes with blades instead of judges. A man's word became his bond. A betrayal meant blood. And over time, these groups evolved, refined their rules, passed them down like scripture. Eventually, they'd earn a name feared across the island: La Cosa Nostra, or Thing. This is where our story truly begins, in Sicily's shadow. Sicily in the 19th century was a land defined not just by beauty, but by control, where vast estates blanketed the countryside, and nearly every inch of soil was claimed by the wealthy elite. These latifundia, massive feudal plantations, were ruled by absentee landlords who rarely set foot on their own land. Instead, they installed armed intermediaries, men called gabeloti, who collected rents, enforced rules, and managed labor with a firm and often violent hand. These gabeloti were answerable to no one but their landowners, and over time, many became mini warlords in their own right, blurring the lines between legal authority and personal power. The peasants, the contadini, were left to work the fields, often for pitiful wages and under constant threat. With no land of their own and no legal recourse, they lived at the mercy of these power structures. And when something was stolen or someone was wronged, appealing to the local government wasn't just ineffective. It could be dangerous. The state was corrupt, slow, and seen as a foreign force, especially after the unification of Italy in 1861, when bureaucrats from the north arrived speaking different dialects, enforcing unfamiliar laws. In this climate of vulnerability and injustice, people turned inward, forming tightly knit networks of protection. What began as neighborhood watch groups, or informal pacts between families, slowly evolved into something more organized, more secretive, more dangerous. These were the early fratellans, or brotherhoods, born not from a desire to commit crimes, but from the desperate need to survive in a world where the law was a rumor and violence was a language everyone understood. Over time, these secret societies acquired rules and structure. Loyalty became paramount. Outsiders were excluded. Trust was earned through quiet obedience and proven through action, never words. Disputes between locals were no longer settled in courts, but by men of respect. Men who upheld a parallel system of justice, operating independently from any state or crown. They would mediate land conflicts, settle family feuds, and recover stolen property. But their services came with a price, and their authority was unquestionable. By the late 1800s, this system had taken on a life of its own. What began as protection had morphed into a private government, a shadow state with its own rules, its own leaders, and its own punishments. If you cooperated, life might run smoothly. If you crossed them, or refused to pay what they called pizzo, protection money, you risk everything. They didn't ask twice. They didn't warn. And above all, they demanded silence. Silence became the lifeblood of the organization, more sacred than money, more binding than blood. To betray the brotherhood, to speak to the authorities, or even to acknowledge its existence, was to sign your own death warrant. Families taught children to keep their heads down, to avoid questions, to pretend nothing ever happened. Victims of crimes often refused to name their attackers. Witnesses remembered nothing. This collective refusal to speak became the most powerful weapon of all. They called it Omert, the code of silence, and it would follow them across the ocean. Omert, the code of silence, was not just a rule, it was religion. It shaped the very breath of Sicilian society. Then crossed the sea with every immigrant who carried memories of home, stitched into their coat linings. It wasn't merely about hiding crimes. It was about identity. About trust in a world that offered none. To speak to outsiders, especially the police, was a betrayal worse than violence. A man who broke Omert did not deserve death. He required it. And when that sentence was carried out, no one mourned. In America, Almaty found fertile ground. The early 20th century was an era of suspicion and xenophobia. Italian immigrants were packed into tight urban neighborhoods, are given the worst jobs, and watched warily by a society that considered them other. If something went wrong, if a shop was robbed, if a man disappeared, the last thing you did was call the police. You turned to someone else, someone who moved quietly, commanded respect, and didn't ask twice. In this vacuum of protection, the Mafia stepped in. They weren't seen as criminals yet, not by their own. They were protectors, arbiters, enforcers of justice when justice refused to show up. If your landlord raised the rent illegally or your boss withheld wages, someone could have a word on your behalf. Property returned, debts paid, daughters left unharmed, and in return you offered loyalty and silence. But power rarely stays noble. Slowly, the protectors started demanding more. At first it was a small fee for their help. Then, a regular payment to ensure nothing bad happens. It wasn't a request. It was insurance, written not in ink, but in fear. The Mafia, once protectors against corrupt landlords and police, slowly became extortionists themselves. At first, they were welcomed. Not with flowers, but with gratitude. Small business owners, street vendors, and laborers saw the early Mafia not as gangsters, but as necessary mediators. If someone stole from you, they got it back. If someone threatened your family, they disappeared. It wasn't legal, but it worked. But the price of protection soon changed. What began as voluntary assistance turned into compulsory payments. Bakers, butchers, grocers, all found notes slipped under their doors. For your safety. If you paid, business stayed open. If you didn't, glass shattered, fires started, or worse. The same men who once shielded their neighbors now demanded tribute. And through it all, no one spoke. Omert held firm. This transformation didn't happen in a vacuum. The structure of power in Sicily, already skewed, had simply traveled with the people who remembered it. The Mafia had crossed the ocean in more than name. It had brought its habits, its hierarchy, and its hunger. And the stage was about to grow much bigger. The Great Migration. Mafia comes to America. Between 1880 and 1920, over 4 million Italians arrived in the US. Between 1880 and 1920, over 4 million Italians came to the United States. A wave of humanity that reshaped the cities, sounds, and future of America itself. Many were fleeing a homeland in turmoil. Southern Italy and Sicily, in particular, had been devastated by political chaos, famine, natural disasters, and a crushing feudal economy that had long exploited the rural poor. The dream of America, a land where hard work could finally bring dignity, burned bright. Entire villages emptied. Fathers left wives behind, promising to send for them. Sons kissed aging mothers and boarded ships, not knowing if they'd ever see the olive groves or mountain roads of home again. The journey was brutal. Most traveled in steerage, cramped, unsanitary quarters below deck, jammed shoulder to shoulder for weeks. Illness spread fast. Food was rationed. But it was the price of hope, and for many, it was all they could afford. When they arrived, they faced a second trial. The system. Ellis Island processed thousands each day. Names were mangled or shortened. Medical checks could send you back after weeks at sea. Yet, for those who passed inspection, America's shores opened. Just wide enough to fit a broom, a shovel, or a sewing needle. they weren't welcomed warmly. Italian immigrants were seen as outsiders, papists, criminals, illiterate peasants. Newspapers warned of Dago neighborhoods and accused newcomers of bringing disease, poverty, and violence. Landlords exploited them. Politicians ignored them, unless votes could be bought cheap. The American dream, it turned out, came wrapped in brick dust and tenement soot, so they made homes where they could. Whole streets began to echo with Sicilian dialects. Laundry stretched on lines between buildings. Butchers offered cuts familiar only to the old country. Catholic saints were honored with processions, fireworks, and food in the street. These neighborhoods became sanctuaries, self-contained worlds where English was optional and every face was familiar. These communities came to be known as Little Italies, pockets of identity and resilience crammed into big city blocks. Children sold newspapers. Mothers worked in sweatshops. Men took back, breaking jobs building railroads or working the docks. In the chaos of industrial America, the immigrant dream was forged not in comfort but in grit. Yet these tight-knit enclaves, while vibrant, were also deeply vulnerable. Language barriers, poverty, and distrust of authority made them easy targets for exploitation, and they were often left to police themselves. That vacuum of power, like in Sicily before, attracted a familiar structure, men who offered protection. Who knew how to settle disputes? Who enforced respect when the law would not? These were the early seeds of organized crime in America, not imported in full, but nurtured on American soil. They didn't just arrive with the immigrants, they took shape because of the world the immigrants found. And while Italian families fanned out to cities across the country, 3 hubs in particular grew fast, large, and dangerous. Most were poor, settling in Little Italies, especially in New York City, Chicago, and New Orleans. By the early 20th century, Little Italies had become both havens and pressure cookers, tight clusters of culture, hardship, and hope. In cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, Italian immigrants settled not out of preference, but of necessity. Rent was cheaper where no one else wanted to live. Work was found where the air was thick with soot, and the bosses didn't care if you understood English. These neighborhoods pulsed with life. Markets loud with Sicilian dialects, windows filled with drying laundry. The scent of garlic and tomatoes bleeding into alleyways. But behind the bright colors of feast days and family photos was the daily strain of survival. These families were poor, some deeply so. Fathers took work digging tunnels or paving streets for cents a day. Mothers labored in sweatshops or took in laundry. Children left school early to peddle newspapers, shine shoes, or work in factories. Everyone lived close, too close, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. Walls were thin, roofs leaked, and every corner seemed to echo someone else's hunger. Distrust of the outside world remained deep. Police were often Irish or Anglo, unfamiliar with Italian customs, and quick to label the whole neighborhood as trouble. The courtrooms didn't care for immigrant stories, so residents policed their own disputes and leaned hard into community loyalty. A favor, once granted, could last a lifetime. A betrayal could be remembered for generations. It was here, in these streets, in these cramped apartments, in the smells and rhythms of the old country transplanted onto new soil, that the Mafia found a second birth. Some came with the migration, men already initiated into Sicilian brotherhoods, bearing invisible tattoos of loyalty and silence. Others were American, born sons who learned the rules the way others learned catechism. They watched, listened, and adapted, and they realized quickly fear could be profitable. That's when the letters started arriving. No signature. No threat spelled out. Just crude drawings of a black hand, sometimes clutching a dagger, sometimes dropping blood. Attached were demands: pay a fee or suffer consequences. If payment came, the letter stopped. If it didn't, a brick flew through a bakery window. A fire broke out in a tailor's shop. A child was threatened on the walk home from school. This was the beginning of Black Hand extortion, a crude but terrifying form of organized crime that gripped Italian neighborhoods in fear long before prohibition or nationwide syndicates took shape. And the Mafia came with it. They didn't always claim responsibility. In truth, many of the early Black Handers weren't formally connected to La Cosa Nostra. Some were copycats. Others were small-time hoods with big ambitions. But the atmosphere they created, a fog of intimidation and silence, was perfect for the real power to grow quietly behind it. And grow it did. The Black Hand was more a storm cloud than a structure, ominous, scattered, and unpredictable. In cities across America, from New York to Chicago to Cleveland, Italian immigrants began receiving strange, unsigned letters demanding money, often adorned with crude images of knives, skulls, coffins, or the symbol that gave the terror its name, a black handprint, stark against the page like a death sentence. The effect was immediate and visceral. Families who had already escaped hardship back home now found themselves cornered once again. But this time by ghosts in their own neighborhoods. Pay up, the letters warned, or your shop might burn. Pay up, or your child might vanish. And behind those words, sometimes no one at all. Other times, a small-time thug looking for fast cash. And sometimes, rarely, but enough to matter, someone with real connections. Someone who knew not only how to make a threat, but how to deliver on it. The term, Black Hand, quickly came to represent more than a single group or faction. It described a method, a tactic, a fear. Most terrifying of all, it was hard to distinguish where the empty threats ended and the real danger began. Law enforcement struggled to even comprehend what was happening, dismissing many cases as immigrant superstitions or internal disputes. But to those inside Little Italy's, the terror was very real. Newspapers sensationalized the violence, calling it Mafia warfare or foreign vendettas. In truth, many of these criminals were operating independently, without the hierarchy or tradition that defined the Mafia in Sicily. These weren't yet empires, they were hustles, neighborhood shakedowns, piecemeal rackets. Gangs made up of young men who spoke the same dialect and knew the same codes, trying to carve out power in a city that offered none. In New York alone, dozens of loosely affiliated gangs emerged in the early 1900s. Some specialized in extortion. Others dabbled in illegal gambling or labor racketeering. Violence was messy and frequent. Not strategic, not elegant. More often than not, the victims were fellow Italians, fellow immigrants just trying to survive. A baker threatened by his cousin's friend. A grocer blown up for missing a payment. A tailor who tried to stand his ground and didn't live to see another dawn. This wasn't yet the Mafia of boardroom deals and coast-to-coast operations. There were no 5 families, no commission, no nationwide syndicate to keep peace among rival factions. These were local gangs, street-level criminals preying on the same communities they claimed to defend. They borrowed the language of honor, but spoke only in fear. And so, while the seed of the Mafia had been planted, its roots still shallow, its canopy not yet grown, it was clear something bigger was coming. Because with power came profit, and with profit came ambition. But for now, it was not yet organized, just local gangs exploiting their own communities. The criminal landscape in early 20th century America was chaotic, fragmented, and fiercely local. Dozens of petty crews and pocket gangs had emerged in Italian neighborhoods, mimicking pieces of the old Sicilian code, but lacking the structure or cohesion that would later define organized crime. They were territorial, but not strategic. They exacted tribute, but lacked restraint. Violence flared easily, often over petty disputes, women or turf that barely stretched a few blocks. The idea of one boss answering to another was alien. This was a street game, not a syndicate. In New York, groups like the Morello Gang operated out of Harlem, stamping out counterfeit bills and settling feuds with fire. In Chicago, small rackets muscled into control of immigrant labor yards. In Cleveland, Detroit, San Francisco, wherever enough Italian families gathered, someone eventually declared himself in charge, and someone else tried to dispute it. There was no larger vision, just ambition, muscle, and fear. These local gangs operated in the open yet shrouded in silence. The police were often either complicit or clueless. The public, especially the immigrant public, didn't speak. Newspapers latched onto the fear, throwing the term Mafia onto any Italian name linked to crime, whether or not the men had ever heard of La Cosa Nostra. In truth, what existed in America at that time wasn't a true mafia. It was the raw material. A volatile mass of street thugs, half-remembered traditions, and lawless ambition waiting for something, or someone, to shape it into something enduring. And before order came, there was blood, a flashpoint, a reckoning. The first blood, New Orleans and the 1891 massacre in 1890. Police Chief David Hennessy was murdered in New Orleans on the night of October 15, 1890. Police Chief David Hennessy was walking home in New Orleans when assassins struck, rifle shots echoing in the dark. He collapsed near the intersection of Girard and Basin Streets, riddled with bullets. As neighbors ran to his side, Hennessy reportedly uttered his final words, "The Dago's got me." Whether he truly said it or not, those words, fueled by ethnic hostility and fear, would light a fuse that had been smoldering for years. Hennessy had been a rising star in the city's corrupt and labyrinthine police force, known for his tough stance on criminal elements in the Italian-American community. At the time, New Orleans was home to one of the largest Italian immigrant populations in the country, particularly Sicilians, and tensions between locals and newcomers were growing. Accusations of crime, secret societies, and the ominous spectre of the Mafia had already begun to swirl. In the weeks that followed the murder, the city exploded in paranoia and rage. The press eagerly stoked suspicion, drawing upon old world fears and anti-immigrant sentiment. Without solid evidence, but under immense political and public pressure, police rounded up dozens of Italian immigrants, most of them Sicilian, accusing them of conspiring in the assassination plot. The trial was chaotic. Witnesses recanted. Jurors were intimidated. 12 men stood trial, and on March 13, 1891, all were acquitted or had mistrials declared. That should have ended it. But it didn't. What came next would mark one of the darkest and most shameful episodes in American justice. A moment when fear overtook fact and vengeance drowned the law. Dozens of Italians were arrested, 11 lynched by a mob. They came at dawn. On March 14, 1891, a crowd began to gather outside the parish prison in New Orleans. By midday, it had swelled into a mob of thousands, many of them armed, many of them furious. Newspapers had fanned the flames, calling the verdict a miscarriage of justice and painting the Italian defendants as foreign invaders, hiding behind their own code of silence. That morning, local leaders, judges, politicians, even a few businessmen, stood on crates and gave speeches to the angry throng. They didn't demand justice. They called for revenge. and the city watched as it happened. The prison gates were forced open. The mob stormed inside. They dragged men from their cells, men who had already been tried, acquitted, or never even stood trial. Some were shot point blank. Others were hanged from lamp posts or prison beams. At least 11 Italian men died that day, killed without trial, without appeal, their bodies left on display as a warning or a triumph. No one was prosecuted. No one was punished. In fact, many newspapers across the country celebrated the killings. Editorials defended the mob. Some public figures even thanked them for finishing the job the courts couldn't. Italy protested, furious that its citizens had been slaughtered on foreign soil. Diplomatic ties between the two nations nearly broke. President Benjamin Harrison later paid reparations, but the scars of that day, both for the Italian, American community and for American justice itself, ran much deeper. It was the largest mass lynching in US history, and yet there were no apologies, no courtroom reckonings, no remorse in the headlines. In fact, the aftermath marked a chilling new chapter, not only in anti-immigrant violence, but in the American public's understanding of organized crime. The victims, whatever their guilt or innocence, had been reduced to caricatures before their bodies hit the ground. They weren't seen as individuals anymore, but as threats, as invaders, as symbols of something darker. That something quickly got a name. In the panic and spectacle that followed, newspapers across the country seized on a term that had been whispered in Italian neighborhoods, but rarely spoken in public. Mafia. Most Americans had never heard the word before, but now it blared across front pages. Editorials speculated about Italian secret societies and blood oaths. Politicians used it to justify tighter immigration policies and policing. Writers conjured images of dark, suited killers lurking in alleyways with Sicilian knives and vendettas. The truth was more complicated. Some of the lynched men were entirely innocent, and others had loose ties to local underworld figures. But the nuance was lost. What mattered was the name. And once it entered the bloodstream of American media, it never left. It was the first time Americans heard the word Mafia in headlines. It wasn't in reference to a sprawling criminal empire or a Hollywood anti-hero. It was in the wake of blood. The 1891 lynching in New Orleans had introduced the term to the American public, not through careful study or cultural exchange, but through fear, violence, and sensationalism. The press seized on it, branding the accused men not just as criminals, but as members of a shadowy, foreign conspiracy. Mafia became shorthand for everything dangerous, secretive, and un-American. And once the word took root, it grew. Over the next few decades, the term Mafia would be used broadly, often inaccurately, to describe any Italian criminal activity. It became a catch-all label, applied to petty thieves, extortionists, and even innocent immigrants, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But beneath the exaggeration, something real was forming. The scattered gangs and neighborhood enforcers were beginning to evolve. They were learning from each other, watching how fear could be monetized, how silence could be weaponized, and how loyalty could be enforced not just with threats, but with ritual. Still, in the early 1900s, the Mafia in America was not yet the vast, coordinated machine it would become. It was fragmented, local, and often clumsy. Crews fought over street corners. Leaders rose and fell with little ceremony. There was no national structure, no commission, no 5 families. Just ambition, muscle, and a growing sense that something bigger was possible. Then came a moment that changed everything. In 1919, the United States ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The following year, Congress passed the Volstead Act, which provided the legal framework for enforcing prohibition. What followed was one of the most sweeping social experiments in American history, and one of its most spectacular failures. The Prohibition Gold Rush 1920-1933 had begun, and the Mafia was ready, because when the law banned alcohol, the underworld saw opportunity. The Volstead Act banned alcohol, so the Mafia stepped in to supply it. More than just a crime, it became a business, and business was about to boom. The Volstead Act, passed in 1919 and enacted in 1920, was meant to usher in a new era of moral clarity in America. It did the opposite. By banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, the federal government didn't eliminate demand. It simply handed supply to the shadows. And in those shadows, the Mafia was waiting. For decades, Italian, American gangs had lingered on the margins, shaking down local businesses, settling neighborhood disputes, and occasionally dabbling in vice. But Prohibition changed the scale. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about profit, and more of it than anyone had ever seen. The thirst for alcohol didn't vanish. It multiplied. From the speakeasies of Manhattan to the jazz clubs of Chicago, Americans drank more than ever. Only now, they paid criminals to do it. The Mafia stepped in with speed and precision. They bought up closed breweries and distilleries. They smuggled whiskey from Canada and rum from the Caribbean. They bribed police, judges, and politicians. They built fleets of trucks, hired chemists, and ran entire bottling operations under fake storefronts. And they weren't alone. Irish, Jewish, and Polish gangs joined the fray. But the Mafia, especially in cities like New York and Chicago, proved uniquely suited to the task. They had the networks, the discipline, and the code of silence. They didn't just sell liquor. They controlled it. Production, distribution, enforcement. Every bottle poured in a speakeasy meant money, in their pockets, on the streets if anyone got in the way. Prohibition didn't just give the Mafia a business, it gave them a blueprint. A way to turn street thuggery into a national enterprise. A way to turn fear into infrastructure. Bootlegging became the Mafia's first true empire. And it would change America forever. Bootlegging became the Mafia's first true empire, not just in scale, but in structure. Before Prohibition, the underworld was a patchwork of petty criminals and neighborhood enforcers. But the moment alcohol went underground, the Mafia saw the future. They didn't just sell liquor, they built an industry. They bought up shuttered breweries and distilleries, hired skilled chemists to refine product, and created vast distribution networks that stretched from Canadian border towns to the speakeasies of Manhattan and the jazz clubs of Chicago. They bribed police captains, judges, and city officials. They paid off dock workers to look the other way as crates of whiskey arrived from Scotland or rum from the Caribbean. They ran fleets of trucks, often disguised as bakery or dairy deliveries, to move product across state lines. And when competition arose, they didn't negotiate, they bombed, shot, and buried it. This wasn't chaos. It was logistics. The Mafia began to operate like a corporation, one with no shareholders, no oversight, and no tolerance for failure. They kept ledgers. They employed lawyers and accountants. They diversified into nightclubs, gambling dens, and brothels. And they reinvested their profits into real estate, into politics, into the very fabric of the cities they operated in. In New York, men like Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky turned bootlegging into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. In Chicago, Johnny Torrio and his protégé Al Capone built an empire, so vast it rivaled the city government in influence. These weren't street thugs anymore. They were businessmen, ruthless, yes, but strategic. They understood supply chains, market demand, and the value of silence. Gangs in New York and Chicago evolved from thugs to businessmen. In the roaring heart of the 1920s, the gangs of New York and Chicago underwent a transformation that would redefine the American underworld. No longer content with street-level extortion or petty rackets, they began to think in terms of infrastructure, supply chains, and territorial monopolies. The bootlegging boom had taught them that violence alone couldn't sustain an empire, but organization could. In New York, figures like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, and Meyer Lansky began to reshape the criminal landscape. They moved away from the old world feuds and tribal loyalties that had fractured earlier gangs. Instead, they emphasized efficiency, profit, and cooperation across ethnic lines. Luciano, in particular, envisioned a syndicate that operated like a corporation, divided into families, each with its own territory, but united under a shared code and a governing body. It was a radical departure from the chaos of the past. In Chicago, Al Capone took the lessons of his mentor Johnny Torrio and built a criminal empire that rivaled the city government in both reach and revenue. Capone understood optics. He dressed like a banker, donated to charities, and posed for the press. But behind the charm was a machine of intimidation and control. His organization ran breweries, controlled distribution routes, and enforced discipline with brutal precision. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a CEO of Vice. These men didn't just sell illegal liquor. They built ecosystems around it. They bought politicians, placed judges on payrolls, and infiltrated unions. They laundered money through restaurants, laundromats, and construction firms. They created front companies, falsified records, and used legitimate businesses to shield their operations. The line between criminal and capitalist blurred, and at the center of it all were the speakeasies. Hidden bars tucked behind barber shops, beneath tenements, or inside lavish clubs. These were the beating hearts of the underground economy, where jazz played, deals were struck, and the liquor flowed freely. To keep them running, the Mafia bribed police captains, paid off federal agents, and ensured that entire neighborhoods remained under their protection, or their threat. Their reach extended far beyond city limits. Whiskey came down from Canada, smuggled across frozen lakes or hidden in freight trains. Rum arrived from Cuba and the Caribbean, ferried by fast boats under cover of night. Trucks moved product across state lines, guarded by armed convoys and greased palms. Speakeasies bribed cops, bootlegging networks from Canada to Cuba. This was no longer crime. It was an empire, and it was just getting started. Speakeasies bribed cops, bootlegging networks from Canada to Cuba. This was the machinery of Prohibition's underworld, and it ran with ruthless efficiency. In New York, liquor flowed through hidden tunnels beneath tenements and was served in velvet, draped clubs guarded by doormen who asked for passwords, not IDs. In Miami, room runners unloaded crates from fast boats under moonlight, slipping past Coast Guard patrols with practiced ease. In Detroit, whiskey crossed the frozen Detroit River from Windsor, Canada, ferried by trucks with false bottoms and drivers who knew which border agents to pay and which to avoid. In every city, the Mafia's grip tightened, not just on alcohol, but on the systems meant to stop it. Law enforcement was outmatched. Underpaid and overwhelmed, many officers took bribes just to look the other way. Others were on the payroll outright, tipping off gangsters before raids or escorting shipments through city limits. Judges dismissed cases. Politicians accepted campaign donations with a wink. The line between criminal and official blurred until, in some places, it vanished entirely. The profits were staggering. A single shipment of imported scotch could net thousands. A well-run speakeasy might earn more in a week than a legitimate bar had made in a month before Prohibition. And the money didn't just stay in the underworld. It bought influence, real estate, and respectability. Mobsters began appearing in tailored suits, driving luxury cars, attending charity galas. They were criminals. Yes, but they were also celebrities. And none more so than the man who would come to define the era. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents. He grew up in a world of tight tenements, street gangs, and limited opportunity. By his teens, he had joined the notorious 5 Points gang, where he learned the basics of extortion, protection rackets, and street-level enforcement. It was during this time that he earned the nickname Scarface, after a barroom brawl left him with a deep slash across his cheek, a mark he would spend the rest of his life trying to hide. Capone's early years were defined by ambition and brutality. He worked as a bouncer and bartender for Frankie Yale, a Brooklyn mobster who recognized his potential. But it was Johnny Torrio, a mentor figure and rising power in Chicago's underworld, who gave Capone his true opportunity. In 1919, Torrio invited him west to help manage operations in the Windy City. Capone arrived in Chicago at the perfect moment, just as Prohibition was about to turn the criminal world upside down. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned how to blend violence with diplomacy, how to bribe officials, and how to run a criminal enterprise like a business. When Torrio was nearly killed in a gangland hit in 1925, he retired and handed the reins to Capone. At just 26 years old, Capone became the boss of the Chicago outfit, and he wasted no time expanding its reach. He consolidated power through a mix of charm and terror. Rivals were eliminated, often in broad daylight. Allies were rewarded with cash, protection, and influence. Capone understood the value of public image. He donated to charities, opened soup kitchens during the Depression, and posed for photographs in tailored suits. But behind the smile was a man who ruled with absolute authority. By the late 1920s, Capone's empire was pulling in an estimated $100 million a year from bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and racketeering. His organization employed thousands, from drivers and enforcers to accountants and lawyers. And his influence didn't stop at the city's edge. He controlled judges, mayors, and thousands of businesses. The outfit wasn't just a gang. It was a shadow government, and Capone sat at its head. Capone's reach extended far beyond the back alleys and speakeasies of Chicago. His empire was built not just on violence, but on influence, the kind that seeped into the very institutions meant to stop him. Judges were paid to dismiss charges or delay trials. Mayors received campaign donations and quiet favors. Police captains were on the payroll, tipping off raids or ensuring that certain trucks passed through checkpoints unsearched. In some wards, Capone's men decided who got elected and who didn't. He didn't just control the underworld. He owned parts of the city. Thousands of businesses, from corner groceries to upscale nightclubs, paid protection money to the outfit. Some did it out of fear. Others did it because it was easier than dealing with the law. Still others welcomed the arrangement. Capone's men kept order, settled disputes, and ensured that profits flowed. In neighborhoods where the government was distant or corrupt, the outfit became the authority. Capone's public persona only added to his power. He posed for photos, gave interviews, and played the role of the generous outlaw. He handed out turkeys at Thanksgiving, funded soup kitchens during the Depression, and claimed to be just a businessman. But behind the charm was a man who ruled with absolute ruthlessness. Rivals disappeared, witnesses went silent, and the city for a time seemed to accept it. But power breeds enemies, and in the shadows of Capone's empire, a war was brewing, one that would explode in a garage on Chicago's north side. On the morning of February 14, 1929, in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, 7 men stood lined up against a brick wall. They were members and associates of the North Side Gang, led by George Bugs Moran, Al Capone's fiercest rival. Moments later, they were gunned down in a hail of bullets, most of them from Thompson submachine guns. 2 of the shooters wore police uniforms. The others wore suits and fedoras. None were ever conclusively identified. The victims included Moran's top lieutenants, his brother-in-law James Clark, his enforcers Frank and Peter Gisenberg, and several others tied to the gang's bootlegging operations. Moran himself narrowly escaped the massacre, arriving late to the meeting and spotting the supposed police from a distance. He fled, unknowingly saving his life. The sting. Valentine's Day Massacre was not the first act of gangland violence in Chicago, but it was the most brazen. The image of 7 unarmed men executed in cold blood, some shot over a dozen times, shocked the nation. Photos of the blood-soaked garage ran in newspapers across the country. The public, once fascinated by Capone's swagger and charitable gestures, turned. The massacre stripped away the last illusions of glamour. This wasn't business, it was slaughter. Capone, conveniently in Florida at the time, denied involvement, but few believed him. The massacre was widely seen as his attempt to eliminate Moran and seize total control of Chicago's bootlegging empire. It failed to kill Moran, but it succeeded in turning the full weight of the federal government against Capone. The public outcry was immediate. President Herbert Hoover, already under pressure to address rising crime, made Capone's arrest a federal priority. But despite the blood on his hands, Capone had insulated himself well. Witnesses vanished. Evidence evaporated. Local prosecutors couldn't make murder charges stick, so the government changed tactics. Capone was eventually taken down for tax evasion, not murder. A paper trail, not a bullet, would end his reign. Let me know when you'd like to continue. We'll follow the trail from courtroom to Alcatraz. Capone's empire had been built on blood, bribery and bootlegging, but in the end, it was paperwork that brought him down. Despite years of surveillance, raids, and public outcry, law enforcement had failed to tie Capone directly to the murders, extortion, and racketeering that defined his reign. Witnesses vanished. Jurors were bought. Evidence was buried. But one thing Capone couldn't hide was his wealth. He flaunted it. Tailored suits, diamond rings, luxury cars, while officially claiming no income at all. That contradiction became the government's opening. Led by a team of federal agents and Treasury Department investigators, prosecutors built a case not on violence, but on tax evasion. They tracked down ledgers, uncovered hidden income, and found witnesses willing to testify about Capone's gambling profits and business dealings. In 1931, he was indicted on the 22 counts of tax evasion. The trial was swift. The evidence was clear, and this time, the jury couldn't be bought. Capone was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion at the time. He served time in Atlanta before being transferred to Alcatraz, where isolation and untreated syphilis slowly eroded his mind. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shadow of the man who had once ruled Chicago. But while Capone's fall marked the end of one era, another was just beginning. In New York, a younger generation of mobsters had been watching and learning. They saw the chaos of gang wars, the instability of unchecked ambition, and the danger of drawing too much attention. They wanted something different: structure, discipline, and longevity. In 1931, Charles Lucky Luciano made his move. The Five Families of New York. Formation of the Commission by Lucky Luciano in 1931. A new order was about to rise from the ashes of the old. Let me know when you're ready to continue. We'll step into the Castellamarese War and the birth of modern organized crime. In 1931, the American underworld stood at a crossroads. The bloody Castellamarese War, a year-long conflict between rival Mafia factions in New York, had left dozens dead and the old order in ruins. At its center were two powerful bosses, Joe, the boss, Masiria, and Salvatore Maranzano. Both sought to crown themselves capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses, but their ambition only deepened the chaos. Charles Lucky Luciano, a rising figure with a modern vision, had grown tired of the old world feuds and rigid traditions. He saw the violence as bad for business, unpredictable, wasteful, and unsustainable. So he made a move that would change organized crime forever. First, he betrayed and orchestrated the murder of Masiria. Then, months later, he did the same to Maranzano, eliminating the last man who tried to rule the Mafia with absolute power. But instead of claiming the title for himself, Luciano did something radical: he abolished it. In its place, he created the Commission, a governing council of Mafia bosses designed to mediate disputes, divide territory, and maintain order across the country. It was a boardroom solution to a street war problem. The Commission would oversee all major Mafia activity in the United States, ensuring that no single boss could dominate the others. It was a structure built not on fear, but on balance, at least in theory. The original commission included the heads of the most powerful families in New York, along with bosses from Chicago and Buffalo. But at its core were five men who would come to define the Mafia's golden age. Their names would echo through decades of crime, politics, and blood. They were Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, and Lucchese, and together, they became known as the Five Families. The names Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, and Lucchese would come to define the architecture of organized crime in New York. And, by extension, the United States, for much of the 20th century. These were not just gangs, they were dynasties, each with its own hierarchy, traditions, and territory. Together, they formed the backbone of the American Mafia's most powerful and enduring structure, the Five Families. Each family was built with a strict chain of command. At the top sat the boss, the ultimate authority. Beneath him, the underboss managed day-to-day operations, while the consigliere served as advisor and mediator. Below them were capos or captains, who oversaw crews of soldiers. The men who carried out the orders, collected the money, and enforced the rules. Associates, often not formally initiated, worked alongside them, hoping to earn trust and eventually be made. The Gambino family, originally led by Vincent Mangano, and later by Albert, Anastasia, and Carlo Gambino, would become the most powerful of the five, known for its control over ports, trucking, and construction. The Genovese family, once headed by Lucky Luciano himself, was the most secretive and sophisticated, often referred to as the Ivy League of organized crime. The Bonanno family, under Joseph Bonanno, maintained strong ties to Sicily and was deeply involved in narcotics trafficking. The Colombo family, born from the Profasi family, was marked by internal strife and rebellion. And the Lucchese family, originally the Gagliano family, built its fortune through labor racketeering and control of the garment industry. These families didn't just coexist. They cooperated. They divided New York into spheres of influence, avoided unnecessary conflict, and shared in national ventures like gambling, loan sharking, and union corruption. Disputes were settled not with bullets, but with meetings. Power was no longer about who had the most soldiers. It was about who had the most influence, the best connections, the deepest pockets. In essence, they created a boardroom-style governance of organized crime, where decisions were made not in alleyways, but around tables, quietly, efficiently, and with deadly consequence. The Commission was more than a peace treaty. It was a corporate charter for organized crime. By establishing a boardroom-style governance, Lucky Luciano and his allies transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of warring factions into a national syndicate with rules, boundaries, and a shared interest in stability. The 5 families of New York, each with its own territory, leadership, and revenue streams, operated like subsidiaries of a larger enterprise. Disputes were no longer settled with bullets in the street, but with votes behind closed doors. The Commission met to approve new bosses, mediate conflicts, and coordinate national ventures. It wasn't just about avoiding war. It was about maximizing profit. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and narcotics trafficking were divided and managed like business portfolios. Even murder was regulated. A sanctioned hit required approval, often from multiple families. This wasn't morality. It was management. Unchecked violence drew attention. Attention threatened the enterprise. Luciano's vision extended beyond New York. He invited bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities to join the Commission, ensuring that the Mafia's influence stretched from coast to coast. The organization became more disciplined, more secretive, and more efficient. Initiation ceremonies were standardized. Codes of conduct were enforced. Violators were removed quietly, permanently. But this new order didn't mean the Mafia had gone soft. Beneath the polished structure and corporate language, the old rules still applied. Loyalty was absolute. Betrayal was fatal. And while the Commission balanced power across families, it did so with the ever-present threat of violence. Order was maintained not just through consensus, but through fear. Power was balanced with brutality. No one acted alone anymore. Every move was watched. Every decision had consequences. And the Mafia, now more than ever, moved as one. Power within the Mafia was never absolute. It was conditional, negotiated, and constantly watched. Even the most feared bosses operated within a system that demanded consensus and punished recklessness. The Commission ensured that no single family could dominate the others unchecked. Every major decision, hits on high-ranking members, territorial expansion, alliances, required approval. Autonomy existed, but only within the boundaries of shared interest. Step outside those lines, and the response was swift, silent, and final. This balance of power was enforced not just through meetings and mediation, but through brutality. The Mafia's internal justice system was unforgiving. A capo who skimmed profits, a soldier who disobeyed orders, an associate who spoke too freely, each could vanish without a trace. Bodies were rarely found. Questions were never asked. The message was always clear: loyalty was life. Disloyalty was death. No one acted alone anymore. Even personal vendettas required approval. Even whispers of dissent were monitored. The Mafia had become a machine, efficient, hierarchical, and self-correcting. Its strength lay not only in its reach, but in its discipline. And at the heart of that discipline was a single, unbreakable rule: Omert, the code of silence, a code not just of secrecy, but of survival. And it was enforced with terrifying precision. Silence was not a suggestion in the Mafia. It was a commandment. Omerta, the code of silence, was the invisible thread that bound the organization together. It was more than a refusal to speak. It was a way of life, a cultural reflex, a survival instinct passed down like a family heirloom. To break it was not just to betray the Mafia. It was to betray your blood, your name, your past. From the moment a man was made, he swore an oath that placed loyalty above all else. That oath was sealed with ritual, often involving blood, fire, and the image of a burning saint. The message was clear: if you betray this family, you burn like this image. The ceremony was sacred, but its consequences were brutally real. Enforcement of silence began with fear. The Mafia didn't need to remind its members what happened to traitors. Examples were everywhere. A man who talked might vanish overnight. His body might be found in a ditch, or never found at all. Sometimes the punishment was more symbolic: a bullet in the mouth, a tongue cut out, a corpse left in public view as a warning. These weren't just executions, they were messages. But fear alone wasn't enough. The Mafia also enforced silence through culture. Children in Mafia neighborhoods were taught early: don't ask questions, don't talk to outsiders, don't trust the police. Even victims of crimes, robbery, assault, extortion, often refused to testify. To cooperate with law enforcement was to mark yourself and your family for death. The police were not seen as protectors, they were outsiders. And outsiders were dangerous. Inside the organization, surveillance was constant. Capos watched their soldiers. Soldiers watched each other. Even casual conversations were monitored. A careless word in a bar, a whispered complaint, a joke taken the wrong way. Any of these could be interpreted as disloyalty. And disloyalty was a death sentence. The Mafia also used collective punishment. If a man talked, his family might suffer. A brother might be beaten. A cousin might lose his job. A wife might be left a widow. This wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. It ensured that silence wasn't just a personal choice, but a communal obligation. Everyone had something to lose. Over time, this system became self-sustaining. People didn't need to be told to stay quiet, they simply did. It was safer. It was expected. It was the only way to survive. Witnesses disappeared. Families stayed quiet. And the silence became louder than any confession. In neighborhoods where the Mafia held sway, silence wasn't just expected. It was instinctive. A man might see his neighbor dragged into a car and never return, but he'd say nothing. A shopkeeper might find his storefront shattered after refusing to pay protection, but when the police came, he'd shrug and sweep the glass. Even when the violence was public, bodies left in alleys, gunshots echoing through tenements, no one talked. Not to the press, not to the police, not even to each other. This silence wasn't born of ignorance. It was born of understanding. Everyone knew who was responsible. Everyone knew what would happen if they spoke. And so, they didn't. The Mafia didn't need to threaten every witness. The threat was ambient, woven into the fabric of daily life. It was in the stories whispered behind closed doors, in the funerals held without questions, in the children taught to look away. The law might offer protection, but the Mafia offered consequences. Swift, certain, and final. Even those outside the organization learned the rules. A bartender who overheard too much. A driver who delivered a package without asking what was inside. A landlord who rented a back room to men who paid in cash and never gave names. They all understood curiosity was dangerous. Cooperation was fatal. And so the silence held, not because people didn't care, but because they cared too much for their families, their futures, their lives. In this world, justice wasn't blind. It was absent, and in its place stood a code older than any statute. Loyalty mattered more than law, and it was enforced not by courts, but by fear, blood, and the unspoken promise that betrayal would never be forgiven. In the world of the Mafia, the law was not a shield. It was an obstacle. The courts could be bribed, the police missiled, the politicians bought. But loyalty was sacred. It was the glue that held the entire structure together, more binding than any contract, more enduring than any oath sworn in a courtroom. A man's word, once given to his family, was not just a promise, it was a bond of blood. This loyalty wasn't abstract. It was lived, enforced, and expected in every interaction. A soldier didn't question his capo's orders. A capo didn't defy his boss. Even when the orders were brutal, even when they went against personal interest or conscience, obedience was absolute. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. To disobey was to invite death. The Mafia didn't rely on written agreements or legal protections. It relied on trust, earned, tested, and reinforced through shared risk and mutual silence. A man who proved himself loyal could rise, could earn, could be protected. A man who faltered, who hesitated, who even appeared to waver, could be erased. Not just from the organization, but from memory. This culture of loyalty extended beyond the initiated. Associates, family members, even neighborhood residents understood the rules. You didn't talk. You didn't question. You didn't interfere. The Mafia offered its own form of justice, swift, personal, and final. And in many communities, that justice was more reliable than anything the state could offer. When someone was robbed, they didn't file a report. When someone was threatened, they didn't call 911. The police were outsiders, untrusted, ineffective, and often corrupt. The Mafia, for all its violence, was present. It listened. It acted. You didn't go to the police. You went to your boss. Because in that world, justice wore a tailored suit and spoke in whispers. And it always remembered who owed what to whom. You didn't go to the police. You went to your boss. That was the rule. And it applied to everything from petty disputes to life and death matters. If your truck was hijacked, if your brother-in-law was skimming from the numbers racket, if someone insulted your wife at a club owned by the family, you didn't file a report. You brought it to the man above you. Justice was internal, swift, and final. This system of internal arbitration gave the Mafia a kind of sovereign authority. It allowed them to operate parallel to the state, often more efficiently and with far greater reach. And it wasn't limited to street-level grievances. Entire industries, construction, garbage hauling, garment manufacturing, shipping, were governed by this shadow code. Union bosses, contractors, and business owners all knew the chain of command. Disputes were settled in back rooms, not courtrooms. Favors were exchanged, debts recorded, and silence maintained. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the Teamsters Union under Jimmy Hoffa. As president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Hoffa transformed the union into one of the most powerful labor organizations in the country. But behind the scenes, the Teamsters became a financial engine for the Mafia, through control of the union's vast pension fund, particularly the Central States Pension Fund. Billions of dollars were funneled into mob-controlled ventures. Loans were issued to build casinos in Las Vegas, to finance real estate developments in Florida and California, to prop up failing businesses that served as fronts for laundering money. These weren't investments in the traditional sense. They were strategic placements of capital, designed to expand influence, reward loyalty, and generate untraceable income. The pension fund became a slush pool for organized crime, and Hoffa, whether by design or necessity, was at the center of it. The Mafia didn't just benefit from the Teamsters' money, they used the union's muscle. Strikes could be called or cancelled. Shipments could be delayed or rerouted. Entire industries could be brought to a halt with a phone call. And through it all, the money flowed. Quietly, invisibly, and in staggering amounts. Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa, billions laundered. And the line between labor and organized crime blurred until it nearly disappeared. The Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa became more than a labor union. They became a financial engine for organized crime. With over 2 million members at its peak, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters wielded immense power over the American economy, particularly in transportation and logistics. But it was the union's Central States Pension Fund that became the Mafia's golden goose. Hoffa, who rose from grassroots organizing to national leadership, understood the leverage that came with controlling billions in pension assets. Under his watch, the fund was used not just to secure retirement for workers, but to finance mob-backed ventures across the country. Loans were issued to build casinos in Las Vegas, bankroll real estate developments in Florida and California, and prop up businesses that served as fronts for laundering illicit profits. These weren't traditional investments. They were strategic placements of capital, designed to expand Mafia influence and generate untraceable income. The fund's managers, including Hoffa's close associate Alan Dorfman, had deep ties to the Chicago outfit. They funneled money into projects controlled by mobsters like Anthony, Tony Provenzano, and other figures from the Genovese and Detroit crime families. In return, the Mafia ensured labor peace, controlled union elections, and protected Hoffa's position at the top. It was a symbiotic relationship, corrupt, efficient, and immensely profitable. But the pension fund was only one piece of the puzzle. The Teamsters also gave the Mafia muscle. They could call strikes, delay shipments, or shut down entire industries with a phone call. Trucking routes were assigned, not negotiated. Non-union operators were harassed or driven out. And when disputes arose, they were settled not in boardrooms, but in back alleys. By the late 1960s, federal investigators began to unravel the web. Hoffa was convicted of fraud and jury tampering in 1964 and imprisoned in 1967. But even behind bars, he continued to pull strings. When he disappeared in 1975, presumably murdered by those he once empowered, the pension fund was already under scrutiny. Billions had vanished into mob-controlled projects, many of which collapsed or were never meant to succeed. The fund, once a symbol of labor strength, had become a monument to corruption. And yet, the Mafia's grip didn't end with Hoffa. The infrastructure he helped build, the connections, the influence, the financial pipelines, remained intact. The mob's reach extended beyond unions and pension funds. It reached into the very bones of American cities. Mob-controlled city contracts, garbage collection, shipping docks. These became the next frontiers of organized crime. And the Mafia was ready to dig in. The Mafia's grip on American cities extended far beyond the shadows of alleyways and speakeasies. By the mid-20th century, they had embedded themselves in the very infrastructure of urban life. City contracts, garbage collection, and shipping docks became lucrative strongholds of control and corruption. In cities like New York, Newark, and Chicago, mob-controlled companies dominated the sanitation industry. Waste management, with its cash, heavy operations, and minimal oversight, was the perfect front. The Mafia rigged bids, fixed prices, and carved up territories like feudal lords. Competing haulers were threatened, their trucks torched or their drivers beaten. Customers had no choice. If you wanted your trash picked up, you paid the invisible tax. To the mob, the docks were no different. Longshoremen's unions, especially in ports like New York and New Jersey, fell under the sway of crime families. The Genovese and Gambino families, in particular, controlled hiring halls, dictated shipping schedules, and skimmed from every crate that passed through. Smuggling, theft, and kickbacks became routine. A container might arrive full and leave half empty, its contents quietly rerouted to mob warehouses. Dock workers who resisted were blacklisted, or worse. Construction contracts were another goldmine. Through control of labor unions and building inspectors, the Mafia ensured that only their companies won bids for public works projects, roads, bridges, schools, even hospitals. Materials were siphoned off, deadlines manipulated, and costs inflated. Cement and concrete firms, often mob-owned, supplied substandard materials at premium prices. Entire skylines were built on backroom deals and silent threats. This control wasn't just economic, it was political. The Mafia understood that to protect their rackets, they needed allies in City Hall, and so they funded campaigns, bought influence, and when necessary, issued threats. Politicians who played along were rewarded with donations, votes, and quiet support. Those who resisted found themselves facing scandals, smear campaigns, or worse. The line between public servant and mob asset blurred, until in some cities, it vanished entirely. The Mafia's influence over politicians was neither subtle nor sporadic. It was systemic. In city after city, candidates for office found themselves at a crossroads: accept Mafia money and support, or face a campaign of quiet sabotage. For those who cooperated, the rewards were generous. Campaign donations, guaranteed votes, and the promise of labor peace. For those who resisted, the consequences ranged from whispered rumors to public scandals, and in some cases, physical intimidation or worse. Mobsters didn't need to run for office. They simply owned the people who did. City council members, state legislators, even mayors were drawn into the web. Some were willing participants, seduced by power and profit. Others were coerced, their secrets held like knives at their throats. The Mafia understood leverage, and politics offered it in abundance. A zoning change here, a construction permit there, a no-bid contract awarded to a shell company. Each decision greased the wheels of the criminal machine. In return, politicians received more than just money. They gained access to a network of enforcers, fixers, and silent allies. Elections could be influenced through union pressure, ballot manipulation, or simple intimidation at the polls. Opponents might find their donors harassed, their rallies disrupted, or their reputations quietly dismantled. The Mafia didn't need to control every office. They only needed enough to keep the system pliable. This political protection allowed the Mafia to expand its reach into every corner of urban life. Garbage collection, construction, shipping, even school lunch programs, all became sources of income and influence. And when investigations loomed or journalists got too close, a well-placed phone call or campaign contribution could make the problem disappear. But the Mafia's true shield wasn't always in City Hall. It wore a badge. Corrupt police allowed Mafia zones to thrive in every city. And with every bribe accepted, every report buried, the line between law and crime blurred further. In neighborhoods where the Mafia operated, law enforcement often served not as a barrier, but as a buffer, shielding the organization from scrutiny, while quietly profiting from its success. Officers on the take turned a blind eye to illegal gambling dens, brothels, and backroom card games. Detectives leaked information about upcoming raids. Evidence disappeared from lockers. Arrests were made for show, then quietly dropped. The badge, once a symbol of order, became a tool of complicity. This corruption wasn't limited to a few rogue cops. In many cities, entire precincts were compromised. Promotions were influenced by mob connections. Internal investigations were stalled or sabotaged. Honest officers found themselves isolated, transferred, or worse. The Mafia didn't need to control every cop, just enough to ensure that their operations remained untouched. And in cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, that threshold was easily met. The result was a patchwork of Mafia-controlled zones, where the rules of the street mattered more than the laws of the state. In these enclaves, the mob collected debts, settled disputes, and enforced silence. Residents learned quickly who held real power, and for many, it was safer to deal with the Mafia than to trust the police. This protection allowed the Mafia to expand, not just in influence, but in ambition. With law enforcement compromised and political allies secured, the mob began to look westward, toward a dusty stretch of Nevada desert where gambling was legal, oversight was minimal, and opportunity was limitless. The mob helped build Vegas' Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel, and in doing so, they turned a barren highway into the most profitable strip of land in America. Las Vegas in the 1940s was little more than a dusty outpost in the Nevada desert, known for its legalized gambling and little else. But to the Mafia, it was a blank canvas, an opportunity to build something new, something permanent, something legal on the surface and deeply profitable beneath it. And at the center of that vision stood Benjamin, Bugsy Siegel. Siegel, a charismatic and volatile gangster, with roots in New York's Jewish mob, had already made his mark in Los Angeles, running gambling operations and cultivating ties with Hollywood elites. But it was in Las Vegas that he saw the future. He didn't want another smoky gambling hall or a seedy backroom operation. He wanted a palace, a resort that would rival anything in Monte Carlo or the Riviera. He wanted the Flamingo. The Flamingo Hotel began as the dream of Billy Wilkerson, a Hollywood publisher and restaurateur who envisioned a luxury casino hotel unlike anything in the American West. But Wilkerson ran out of money, and Siegel, backed by East Coast mob money, took over the project in 1946. What followed was a whirlwind of ambition, excess, and spiraling costs. Siegel poured millions into the Flamingo, importing marble from Italy, hiring top entertainers, and sparing no expense on DA Corps. The budget ballooned from $1,000 million to over $600 million, much of it coming from mob investors who expected a quick return. When the Flamingo opened on December 26, 1946, it was a disaster. Rain kept guests away, the hotel wasn't finished, and the casino hemorrhaged money. Siegel was humiliated, but he refused to give up. He closed the hotel, completed construction, and reopened it in March 1947. This time it worked. The Flamingo turned a profit. It became the blueprint for the modern Las Vegas Strip, glamorous, indulgent, and open all night. But for Siegel, it was too late. His mob backers, suspicious of missing funds and slow returns, had lost patience. On June 20, 1947, he was shot dead in Beverly Hills, a gun down while reading a newspaper in his girlfriend's home. No one was ever charged. The message was clear: the Mafia built Vegas, and no one, not even Bugsy Siegel, was bigger than the business. After Siegel's death, the Flamingo thrived under mob management. And it wasn't alone. The Mafia poured money into other casinos, the Sands, the Tropicana, the Riviera, using fronts and silent partners to maintain control. Las Vegas became a mob town, its skyline shaped by syndicate dollars, and its economy fueled by vice. And with every chip cashed, every bet placed, and every room booked, the Mafia found a new opportunity, not just to profit, but to clean the money pouring in from drugs, extortion, and racketeering. Casinos became money laundering gold mines, and the desert bloomed with secrets. The brilliance of the scheme lay in its simplicity. Dirty money, profits from narcotics, extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling, was funneled into casinos under the guise of legitimate winnings. A mobster could walk in with a suitcase of untraceable cash, buy chips, play a few hands, and then cash out with a receipt and a check. The money was now clean, its criminal origins obscured by the glittering lights and ringing slot machines of the Strip. The scale was staggering. Millions flowed through the count rooms of mob-controlled casinos like the Stardust, the Tropicana, and the Riviera. Skimming operations, where a percentage of the casino's daily take was siphoned off before it was ever recorded, became routine. The money was then flown or driven back east, divided among the families, and reinvested in other ventures. No taxes, no records, no questions. To the public, Las Vegas was a playground of neon and indulgence. Celebrities performed nightly. Tourists flocked to the tables. Politicians and businessmen rubbed shoulders with gangsters in the lobbies of luxury hotels. The city sold a fantasy, and the Mafia bankrolled it. Behind the scenes, the mob's control was absolute. Casino managers were often front men, their names on the licenses, while real decisions were made in back rooms by men with no official ties. Union leaders ensured labor peace. Suppliers were handpicked. Even the entertainment was curated, with performers who knew better than to ask who really signed their checks. And through it all, the FBI turned a blind eye for years. Vegas was the perfect mix of glitz and crime, too profitable to disrupt, too seductive to resist. The desert had bloomed, not with flowers, but with secrets, and the house always won. For years, the FBI watched Las Vegas from a distance, aware of the skimming, the silent partners, the suitcases of cash flown out under cover of night, but did little to intervene. The city's transformation into a neon empire had been fueled by mob money, and the Bureau, focused on Cold War threats and lacking the legal tools to dismantle organized crime, let the machine run. The illusion of legitimacy helped. Casinos were licensed, entertainers were glamorous, and the money flowed through banks and payrolls like any other business. But beneath the surface, the Mafia's grip was absolute. Skimmed profits were never reported. Front men signed the checks, but real decisions were made in back rooms by men whose names never appeared on paper. The FBI's files grew thick with surveillance photos and wiretap transcripts, but prosecutions were rare. The mob had built a fortress of plausible deniability, and for a time it held. Vegas thrived in this twilight, half dream, half racket. Politicians vacationed in mob-owned resorts. Celebrities performed in lounges financed by pension fund loans. And the public, dazzled by the spectacle, rarely asked who was really in charge. The city sold fantasy, and the Mafia delivered it, at a price. But the mob's reach didn't end at the casino floor. As its influence spread west, it found another industry ripe for control, one built on image, illusion, and unions. Mob intimidation in film production unions became the next frontier. And Hollywood, like Vegas, would learn what it meant to do business with the underworld. Hollywood in the mid-20th century was a dream factory powered by unions. And the Mafia knew exactly how to exploit that machinery. Film production unions, particularly those tied to stagehands, projectionists, and truck drivers, became prime targets for mob infiltration. These unions controlled everything from set construction to equipment transport. and without their cooperation, a film could grind to a halt before the first reel rolled. The Mafia didn't need to own the studios. They just needed to control the labor. Through intimidation, bribery, and strategic placement of loyalists, crime families inserted themselves into the heart of the entertainment industry. Union leaders who resisted were threatened or replaced. Productions that didn't pay were delayed by sudden strikes or equipment mysteriously going missing. Studios learned quickly it was easier and cheaper to pay the mob tax than to fight it. This influence extended beyond logistics. The mob used its control to secure jobs for associates, launder money through inflated contracts, and muscle in on distribution deals. In some cases, they even influenced casting decisions, ensuring that certain performers or crew members, often with underworld ties, found steady work. The line between Hollywood fantasy and Mafia reality blurred, especially when the two worlds began to overlap socially, and no figure embodied that overlap more than Frank Sinatra. A voice that captivated millions, and a life shadowed by whispers of underworld connections. Frank Sinatra's alleged ties to the Mafia were never proven in court, but they were documented in detail by the FBI, which tracked him for over 40 years. His friendships with known mob figures like Sam Giancana, Willie Moretti, and Lucky Luciano were well known, and he was frequently seen in the company of men tied to the Chicago outfit and the Genovese family. These weren't casual acquaintances. Sinatra performed at mob, owned clubs, accepted favors, and allegedly repaid them with influence, introductions, and appearances. One of the most persistent rumors was that Sinatra helped connect Giancana to John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1960, delivering Union votes through the Teamsters and other channels. He was also said to have introduced JFK to Judith Campbell Exner, Giancana's girlfriend, who later claimed to have acted as a go-between for the two men. Though Sinatra denied any criminal involvement, his FBI file included headings like associations with criminals and hoodlums, and accusations of being a dope racketeer. Sinatra's career was also allegedly shaped by mob intervention. When he wanted out of his contract with bandleader Tommy Dorsey in the early 1940s, the story goes that Moretti, an underboss in the Genovese family, held a gun to Dorsey's head and forced him to release Sinatra for a token payment. That tale, whether apocryphal or not, was later fictionalized in The Godfather as the story of Johnny Fontaine. And that's where the irony deepens. Because while The Godfather would become the definitive portrayal of the Mafia in American cinema, its production was shaped, if not outright enabled, by the very people it depicted. Control over theaters, scripts, and stories. That's irony. The Godfather was helped by real mobsters, became the next chapter in the mob's cultural influence. The Mafia's influence over Hollywood didn't stop at labor unions or nightclub circuits. It extended into the very heart of storytelling itself. By the 1960s and 70s, organized crime had a quiet but potent grip on theaters, scripts, and the stories that reached the American public. Film distributors, projectionist unions, and even theater chains in major cities were often under mob control. If a studio wanted its film shown in certain markets, it had to play by the rules. Rules written in back rooms, not boardrooms. This control gave the Mafia a strange kind of editorial power. They could suppress films that portrayed them unfavorably, or promote those that romanticized their image. And no film better captured that paradox than The Godfather. When Mario Puzo's novel was adapted for the screen, real-life mobsters took notice. Some were flattered, others were concerned. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, led by Joseph Colombo, protested the film's production, claiming it would reinforce negative stereotypes. But behind the scenes, Colombo and other mob figures were negotiating, not to stop the film, but to shape it. Producer Al Ruddy met with Colombo and agreed to remove the word Mafia from the script entirely. In return, the league dropped its opposition. Mob-connected individuals were even given bit parts in the film, and some scenes were shot in locations controlled by the five families. The irony was thick. A film about the Mafia's corrosive influence was, in part, made possible by that very influence. And yet, The Godfather became a cultural phenomenon, elevating the myth of the honorable gangster, while softening the brutality of the real thing. It was art imitating life, and life quietly editing the script. That same blend of myth and manipulation extended beyond Hollywood. Because long before The Godfather hit theaters, whispers had already begun. Rumors the Mafia helped JFK get elected. And those whispers would echo all the way to the White House. The 1960 presidential election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon was one of the tightest in American history, and one of the most controversial. In the years that followed, rumors swirled that the Mafia had played a decisive role in swinging the election in Kennedy's favor, particularly in key states like Illinois and West Virginia. At the center of these claims was Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit. According to multiple accounts, including those from Giancana's own relatives and former FBI agents, Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, allegedly struck a deal with Giancana to deliver the votes, and the new administration would lay off organized crime. The outfit, with its deep ties to Chicago's Democratic machine, was said to have mobilized union support, manipulated vote counts in mob-controlled wards, and ensured that Kennedy carried Illinois by a razor-thin margin. Frank Sinatra, a close friend of both JFK and Giancana, was rumored to have acted as a go-between. He campaigned vigorously for Kennedy and allegedly helped broker the understanding between the Kennedys and the mob. In return, the Mafia expected protection, or at least indifference, from the federal government. But the celebration was short-lived. Once in office, President Kennedy appointed his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, and Bobby came with a mission to dismantle organized crime. He launched aggressive investigations, expanded wiretapping, and brought indictments against top mob figures, including those who believed they had helped put his brother in the White House. Some believe they felt betrayed when Bobby Kennedy cracked down on them. And betrayal, in the world of the Mafia, was never taken lightly. Let me know when you're ready to continue. We'll follow the fallout from that betrayal. To the Mafia, betrayal wasn't just a personal insult. It was a declaration of war. They had allegedly helped deliver the presidency to John F. Kennedy, expecting a return to the quiet tolerance they'd enjoyed under previous administrations. Instead, they got Robert F. Kennedy, a relentless crusader who made dismantling organized crime his top priority as Attorney General. Bobby Kennedy didn't just target low-level enforcers. He went after bosses. He expanded wiretapping, subpoenaed mob-linked union leaders, and launched high-profile prosecutions. Men like Carlos Marcello, Santo Traficante Jr., and Sam Giancana, once considered untouchable, found themselves under constant surveillance and legal pressure. The Justice Department's organized crime section, created under Bobby's watch, became a spearpoint aimed directly at the heart of the syndicate. The mob, already feeling the heat from increased media scrutiny and shifting public sentiment, saw this as a betrayal of the highest order. Some whispered that the Kennedys had used them and then discarded them. Others believed the crackdown was personal. Bobby's way of erasing any stain of association between his family and the underworld. Either way, the gloves were off. And while the Mafia was being squeezed at home, it was also losing ground abroad. Just a few years earlier, Cuba had been their offshore paradise. Havana was a jewel in the mob's crown, a playground of casinos, nightclubs, and high, rolling tourists. But that empire crumbled almost overnight. Cubatized mob casinos in Havana shut down after Castro's revolution, and with the fall of Havana, the Mafia lost more than money. It lost its most glamorous outpost. In the 1950s, Havana was the crown jewel of the Mafia's offshore empire. Under the corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista, American mobsters like Meyer Lansky, Santo Traficante Judah, and Charles Lucky Luciano transformed Cuba into a playground of vice. Lavish casinos, luxury hotels, and glittering nightclubs lined the Malecón, drawing in celebrities, politicians, and tourists by the planeload. The mob funneled millions into the island, laundering money through resorts, like the Hotel National, the Riviera, and the Capri, all while skimming profits and bribing officials to keep the wheels greased. But the revolution was coming. When Fidel Castro and his 26th of July movement overthrew Batista on January 1, 1959, the mob's paradise collapsed almost overnight. Castro's new government viewed the casinos as symbols of foreign exploitation and corruption. Within weeks, slot machines were smashed in the streets, gambling was outlawed, and mob-owned properties were nationalized. Lansky alone lost an estimated $7 million in investments. Traficante, who had deep ties to Batista's inner circle, was briefly imprisoned before being expelled from the country. Some casinos reopened briefly under government control, but the tourists never returned. The golden age of Havana's underworld was over. The Mafia had lost its Caribbean stronghold, and with it, one of its most profitable and glamorous operations. Back in the United States, the loss of Cuba was more than a financial blow. It signaled a shift. The mob's operations were now under greater scrutiny, and the old methods of bribery and intimidation were no longer enough to shield them from the law. By the end of the 1960s, the federal government had begun to adapt, and in 1970, it unveiled its most powerful weapon yet, the RICO Act, designed to bring down entire crime networks, not just individuals. A new era of prosecution was about to begin. Ready for the next chapter? We'll step into the courtroom, where the Mafia's empire began to unravel. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, marked a turning point in the federal government's war against organized crime. Before RICO, law enforcement struggled to prosecute Mafia leaders who insulated themselves from direct criminal acts. Bosses gave orders, but rarely left fingerprints. Prosecutors could catch the soldiers, but the generals walked free. RICO changed that. The law allowed prosecutors to charge individuals not just for specific crimes, but for participating in a criminal enterprise. If a person committed or ordered at least 2 acts of racketeering, such as extortion, bribery, murder, or money laundering, as part of an ongoing organization, they could be charged under RICO. And the penalties were severe, up to 20 years per count, asset forfeiture, and civil suits that could bankrupt entire families. But RICO's true power lay in its ability to target the structure of organized crime. It treated the Mafia not as a collection of individuals, but as a network, a business. That meant prosecutors could go after bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, and capos in a single sweeping indictment. It also encouraged turncoats. Facing decades behind bars, many mobsters flipped, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. The code of silence, omerta, began to crack. Still, It took time for RICO to bear fruit. Throughout the 1970s, the law was used cautiously. But by the 1980s, federal prosecutors had refined their strategy. They built cases slowly, methodically, using wiretaps, surveillance, and insider testimony to map entire crime families. And then the trials began. Major trials in the 80s and 90s finally weakened the Mafia. The courtroom became the new battlefield, and the mob was about to lose ground. The 1980s and 90s marked the beginning of the Mafia's long descent. Not through street wars or rival factions, but through the cold precision of the courtroom. Armed with the RICO Act, federal prosecutors launched a series of sweeping indictments that struck at the heart of the five families and their national allies. No longer content to arrest foot soldiers, the government aimed for the top. And this time, they had the tools to succeed. One of the most pivotal moments came in 1985, when Rudolph Giuliani, then U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, indicted the heads of the five families in what became known as the Commission Trial. Using wiretaps, surveillance, and insider testimony, prosecutors charged the bosses with running a criminal enterprise that included murder, extortion, and labor racketeering. The trial ended in 1987 with 8 convictions, including Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno of the Genovese family and Carmen, Jr., Persico of the Colombos. It was a seismic blow. The Mafia's ruling council had been decapitated in a single stroke. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Maxi trial 1986-1992 unfolded in a specially built bunker courtroom in Palermo. Led by judges Giovanni Falcon and Paolo Borsellino, the trial indicted 475 members of the Sicilian Mafia, relying heavily on testimony from pentiti. Former mafiosi turned informants like Tommaso Buscetta. The trial resulted in 338 convictions and confirmed, for the first time in Italian legal history, the existence of Cosa Nostra as a structured criminal organization. These trials shattered the myth of Mafia invincibility. The once sacred code of silence began to fracture under the weight of long prison sentences and the promise of protection. Prosecutors no longer needed to catch a boss with a smoking gun. They only needed a soldier willing to talk. Bosses flip, testify. Omerta begins to crumble, and with every confession, the underworld grew a little quieter, a little colder, a little more exposed. Shall we keep going? The next chapter is soaked in betrayal. Let's step into the era of turncoats and wiretaps. The Mafia's greatest strength had always been its silence. For decades, Omerta, the sacred code that forbade cooperation with law enforcement, had kept the organization insulated from the inside out. But by the late 1980s, that silence was breaking. And when it broke, it shattered. The first major crack came with Joe Valachi in the 1960s. But it wasn't until the RICO Act matured that the dam truly burst. Facing life sentences and the forfeiture of everything they owned, high-ranking mobsters began to do the unthinkable. They talked. And not just soldiers or associates. Bosses. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano, underboss of the Gambino family, was the most infamous. In 1991, he turned government witness against his own boss, John Gotti. The so-called Teflon Don, Gravano's testimony helped convict Gotti in 1992, ending the reign of one of the most flamboyant and feared mafia leaders in American history. But Gravano was just the beginning. Across the five families, men who once swore blood oaths began cooperating. Phil Leonetti, underboss of the Philadelphia crime family. Tommaso Buscetta, a Sicilian mafioso who exposed the inner workings of Cosa Nostra to Italian prosecutors. Michael Franzese, a Colombo capo who walked away from the life. Each defection peeled back another layer of secrecy, exposing the Mafia's finances, murders, and political connections. The government, armed with wiretaps, surveillance, and now insider testimony, dismantled the Mafia from the top down. Trials that once ended in hung juries now ended in convictions. Entire crews were rolled up in a single sweep. The fear that once kept mouths shut was replaced by the fear of dying in prison. And as the code of silence crumbled, so did the foundations of power. The Gambino and Genovese families slowly collapse. Their leaders imprisoned, their ranks thinned, their influence fading, one courtroom at a time. By the late 1990s, the once mighty pillars of the American Mafia were crumbling under the weight of indictments, surveillance, and betrayal. The Gambino family, long considered the most powerful of the five families, had been gutted by the conviction of John Gotti and the defection of his underboss. Leadership passed to a rotating cast of acting bosses, many of whom were quickly arrested or flipped. The family's grip on unions, construction, and extortion rackets weakened as federal oversight and internal disarray took their toll. The Genovese family, known for its discipline and secrecy, fared slightly better, but not by much. Though it avoided the flamboyance that doomed the Gambinos, it too suffered from relentless federal pressure. Key figures like Vincent, Chin, Giganti, who famously faked mental illness to avoid prosecution, were eventually convicted. The family's once formidable influence over labor unions and the waterfront began to erode, and younger recruits lacked the loyalty and silence of earlier generations. The Mafia's old playbook, intimidation, bribery, silence, was no longer enough. Surveillance technology advanced, RICO cases grew stronger, and perhaps most devastating of all, the code of omerta was no longer sacred. Turncoats like Sammy, the Bull, Gravano didn't just testify, they rewrote the rules of the underworld. And with every betrayal, the myth of the untouchable Mafia faded further into history. Turncoats like Sammy, the Bull, Gravano didn't just betray their bosses, they betrayed the myth. Gravano was no low-level thug. He was the underboss of the Gambino family, second only to John Gotti himself. He had personally participated in or ordered at least 19 murders, including the infamous 1985 hit on boss Paul Castellano, which paved the way for Gotti's rise. Gravano was feared, respected, and deeply embedded in the Mafia's hierarchy. And yet, in 1991, facing life in prison, he flipped. His testimony was devastating. Gravano laid out the inner workings of the Gambino family in meticulous detail. Who gave the orders, who pulled the triggers, how the money flowed, and how the silence was enforced. His cooperation led to Gotti's conviction in 1992, ending the reign of the so-called Teflon Don. But more than that, it shattered the illusion that high-ranking mobsters would never turn. Gravano's defection opened the floodgates. Dozens followed. Capos, consiglieri, even bosses began cooperating with the government. The fear of prison outweighed the fear of retribution. The code of omerta, once sacred, was now negotiable, and with each new witness, the Mafia's secrets became public record. Courtrooms became confessionals. Wiretaps and surveillance filled in the gaps. The mystique of the Mafia, the idea of an unbreakable brotherhood, was replaced by transcripts, plea deals, and televised trials. By the early 2000s, the Mafia still existed, but it was no longer the empire it once was. By 2000s, the Mafia is still around, but a shadow of its former self. Its power fractured, its leaders imprisoned, its silence broken. And the streets it once ruled now whispered of a past that no longer ruled the present. The Grand Commission meetings were gone. The days of public executions, union takeovers, and citywide rackets had faded into memory. What remained were fragments, aging capos, scattered crews, and a legacy that now lived more in movies than in neighborhoods. The five families still existed, but their influence had shrunk. Their names no longer inspired the same fear. Their territories had been carved up, their revenue streams disrupted, and their soldiers thinned by decades of indictments and betrayals. The Mafia had adapted, but it had also retreated. Gone were the flashy suits and street parades. The new generation operated quietly, if at all, low profile, cautious, and often disconnected from the traditions of their fathers and grandfathers. Many of the old rackets, bookmaking, loan sharking, protection, had been overtaken by digital crime, foreign syndicates, or simply rendered obsolete by changing times. And yet, the Mafia didn't vanish, it evolved. With street-level power diminished, many remnants of organized crime shifted their focus. They moved into white-collar crime, fraud, embezzlement, real estate scams, healthcare billing schemes. These crimes were quieter, harder to trace, and far more lucrative. No need for muscle when you could move millions with a pen or a keystroke. The violence declined, but the profits remained. Most power now in white-collar crime, not blood. And the new mob wore suits not to blend in, but because they belonged in the boardroom. By the 2010s, the Mafia had traded brass knuckles for balance sheets. The old-school violence, the hits, the street wars, the public executions had become liabilities. What remained was a leaner, quieter underworld, one that thrived in the shadows of legitimate enterprise. Fraud, embezzlement, healthcare scams, and construction grift replaced the old rackets. The mob no longer needed to shake down a shopkeeper when it could skim millions from Medicare or inflate invoices on a city contract. This shift wasn't just strategic, it was survival. Law enforcement had grown too sophisticated, surveillance too pervasive, and the public too wary, so the Mafia adapted. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and complicit professionals, lawyers, accountants, even bankers, became the new tools of the trade. The violence didn't vanish, but it was reserved, surgical, and often internal. Still, the core of the Mafia's business model remained control, silence, and profit. And while the headlines faded, the operations didn't disappear. The Mafia still exists in small operations, loans, fraud, illegal gambling. Not the empire it once was, but a ghost that still collects. Quiet, patient, enduring. Shall we keep going into the modern underworld? The next chapter traces how these remnants still echo in today's cities. Though the golden age of organized crime has long passed, the Mafia never fully disappeared. Instead, it downsized and decentralized, retreating into smaller, more discreet rackets that still generate steady income. In cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, law enforcement continues to uncover illegal gambling rings, loan sharking operations, and fraud schemes tied to remnants of the five families. Recent indictments show that these operations are often run out of storefronts, social clubs, or even private homes, with betting handled through encrypted apps and coded phone calls. Loan sharking remains a staple, offering fast cash at brutal interest rates, enforced not with baseball bats, but with quiet threats and reputational pressure. Fraud has become more sophisticated, with schemes involving credit card skimming, healthcare billing scams, and identity theft. These aren't the sprawling empires of the past. They're lean, cautious, and often interwoven with legitimate businesses. The violence is rare, the hierarchy flatter, and the ambition more about survival than dominance. But the DNA of the old Mafia remains. Profit through control, silence, and fear. And the men running these operations, they don't wear pinky rings or hold court in smoky back rooms. Old, school, made men have been replaced by quieter businessmen, less visible, more calculating, and just as committed to the code. The suits are still tailored, the rules still apply. But the spotlight is gone, and that's exactly how they want it. Gone are the days of flamboyant dons holding court in smoky back rooms, flanked by soldiers and feared by neighborhoods. Today's remnants of the Mafia operate with a different playbook. One shaped less by tradition and more by discretion. The new generation of mobsters doesn't wear pinky rings or speak in coded Sicilian. They wear tailored suits, run legitimate looking businesses, and move money through shell corporations and offshore accounts. These modern operators are less concerned with turf wars and more focused on financial efficiency. They avoid the spotlight, shun unnecessary violence, and often blend seamlessly into the corporate world. Their meetings happen in boardrooms, not social clubs. Their weapons are contracts, not pistols. And their power lies in influence, not intimidation. This shift has made the Mafia harder to detect and less culturally visible. The public no longer sees the mob on the streets. Instead, it sees it on screens. Pop culture now shapes the image. The Sopranos, The Godfather, and for many, fiction has become the lens through which the underworld is remembered. A myth stylized and immortalized, not a shadow still moving behind the curtain. For most people today, the Mafia lives not in neighborhoods or news headlines, but in the glow of a television screen. The Godfather redefined the gangster as tragic royalty. Men of honor, bound by family, corrupted by power. The Sopranos brought that myth into the suburbs, blending therapy sessions with murder contracts, and showing a mob boss who worried as much about his panic attacks as his rivals. These stories didn't just reflect the Mafia, they reshaped it. Characters like Michael Corleone and Tony Soprano became cultural icons, their quotes etched into everyday language. "I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse." It's not personal, it's strictly business. These lines blurred the line between fiction and history, turning real world violence into cinematic poetry. The brutality was still there, but softened by orchestral scores, family dinners, and existential monologues. And for younger generations, these portrayals became the primary lens through which the Mafia was understood. The blood-soaked reality faded behind the glow of prestige television and Oscar-winning films. The mob became a brand, stylized, dramatized, and endlessly quoted. But not everywhere. In places like Bensonhurst, Chicago's South Side, and Staten Island, the silence remains. The stories may have moved to the screen, but in certain corners of America, the old codes still echo, quiet, watchful, unspoken, and not everything that fades from view is gone. These neighborhoods, once strongholds of Mafia influence, still carry echoes of the old world. In Bensonhurst, the corner cafes and narrow streets remember the days when names like Gotti and Castellano were spoken in hushed tones. In Chicago's South Side, where the outfit once ruled with quiet efficiency, the legacy lingers in the form of unspoken rules and long memories. And in Staten Island, where social clubs once doubled as command posts, the old rituals haven't entirely vanished. They've just gone deeper underground. Here, the silence isn't just absence, it's presence, a knowing glance, a name never mentioned, a story half told. The Mafia may no longer rule the streets, but in these pockets of America, the culture of discretion endures. Not out of fear, perhaps, but out of habit, out of respect, out of memory. This narration was crafted with care and a deep respect for historical accuracy. While every effort was made to stay true to the facts, some details may be subject to interpretation or dispute. History, like the underworld it sometimes chronicles, is rarely black and white. Now close your eyes. Let the noise of the world fade. Sleep well, and let the silence keep watch. Good night.